Welcome to the Manetti Shrem Museum of Art. My name is Ben. I'm a recent art studio and museum studies graduate, and I'm currently serving as a visitor services assistant here at the museum. Before we begin today's program, we should take a moment to acknowledge the land on which UC Davis sits. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of Patwin people. Today, there are three federally recognized Patwin tribes: Quechua-Dihi Band of Wintuan Indians of the Calusa Indian Community, Quetzal-Dihi Wintu Nation, and Yocha-Dihi Wintu Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. On behalf of myself and the entire staff of the Manetti Shrem, thank you for joining us and enjoy the colloquium.
Thank you, Ben. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Teagle, founding director of the Manetti Shrem Museum, and it is truly a pleasure to welcome all of you. Look around. Alan, can you believe all this goodness? Wow. What a pleasure to welcome all of you to this year's Templeton Colloquium in Art History, entitled Making Things, Making Ideas, China-Inspired Objects and International Trade, presented by Tamara Bentley from Colorado College and UC Davis's own Professor of Art History, Catherine Burnett. Thank you so much for bringing this beautiful program to the museum. Every year, the Templeton Colloquium brings to light questions and issues in the field of art history. And as an art historian myself, I'm particularly delighted that the museum is home to your colloquium. Thank you to Art History and to Alan. I'm also very proud of our ongoing collaborations with art history, and we have more projects on the horizon. Next year, the museum will be opening a special exhibition that was curated entirely by students under the guidance of Professor Alex Sofronow, and I think you're here. There you are. Thank you for bringing that project to the museum, and you'll hear more about this exhibition in the fall. And this spring, we will be hosting a faculty discussion featuring art history professor Taline Grigor. And is Taline here? She's not, but she'll be in conversation with our exhibiting artist, Shiva Ahmadi. And I want to encourage all of you to take a few moments after this afternoon's conversation to go back in the galleries and see Shiva's exhibition. We value the collaborations with our art history colleagues and look forward to developing yet more. And I just want to take a moment to thank my esteemed colleagues for all the goodness that you bring to our museum. Now, just a few welcomes. It's always a pleasure to see Alan Templeton at the museum. And of course, you didn't just show up for the colloquium. We saw you in the galleries actually looking at art long before the colloquium started. Thank you for the many ways you support the museum and art history. And today it is my honor to introduce Dean Estela Atequana. Dean Atequana has, I think, the biggest job on this campus. She provides academic and administrative leadership for the largest college on campus. That means she oversees 37 departments and programs with more than 900 faculty across the arts, humanities, social sciences, and mathematical and physical sciences. Dean Atequana is a renowned interdisciplinary geophysicist whose research pioneered the field of biogeophysics. She provided a breakthrough understanding of geophysical signatures of microbial processes in the earth. I literally don't understand what that means as an art historian. But that meant, when Dean Atequana, when she came to campus in 2021, I thought, oh man, the arts, we're really going to suffer under this new dean. What are we going to do? She's a pioneer in biogeophysics, for Christ's sake. Turns out, in my now almost 12 years at this university, we have never had a more ardent advocate for the arts than our dean. It is a regular occurrence to find her right here in the front row of whatever lecture or the many humanities conferences that are held here at the museum. Dean Atequana is supporting the arts with her presence, with her enthusiasm, and with her leadership. I'm proud to say that the arts at UC Davis are truly ascendant, and our progress has been elevated and expedited by our dean. I hope you will please join me in welcoming Dean Estela Atequana.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm really pleased to be here, welcoming all of you to the Alan Templeton Colloquium in Art History. And as Dean of the College of Letters and Science, I'm so proud that our Department of Art History makes this such a special and important event every year. This is my third time coming to this event. It's also a pleasure to partner with our co-hosts for the event, the Jan Shrem and Maria Manetti Shrem Museum of Art. We benefit so much by being a part of such a collaborative community. You know, every single time I have an event in here, it's always standing room only. I was just making a joke to Michael that the next time I'm going to have an event as a dean, I'm going to get it under the false pretense that it is an art event. Then I'm going to get a lot of people because when I invite people to things, they don't show up. So, just saying. And I'd really like to acknowledge Alan Templeton, who's sitting right here, who's taking part of this colloquium, and he's made this possible. As an art history and psychology alumnus and longtime supporter, you've been such a champion for our community, especially supporting our humanities. You know, Alan once told me, he says, you know, everybody gives money to the sciences, but nobody gives money to the humanities. So thank you so much for having a special place in your heart for the humanities. Your multiple endowments within our college include the Templeton Endowed Chair in the History of European Art, 1600 to 1830, which is held by Michael, who's sitting right here, and who is also organizing and moderating this event. Alan, your extraordinary contributions across the arts, humanities, and social sciences have made tremendous impacts for our faculty and students across UC Davis. So we thank you very much. Today, the Templeton Colloquium in Art History explores the immense impact Chinese arts and aesthetics has had on art and design trends worldwide. We are not by any means the first to own beautiful objects that were made in China. For hundreds of years, Chinese aesthetics has influenced design trends and continues to this day. Through the activities of our faculty in the Art History Department, East Asian Studies, and the Global Tea Initiative, UC Davis has a long-standing investment in Chinese studies. Our college is particular, which is home to each of these programs, is an excellent academic setting through which to engage Chinese culture. As a university, a large share of our students join us from China to study. We have a number of eminent scholars here with fellowships from the China Scholarship Council. And this year, 5 of them are here from prestigious institutions across China to study art history. Are they in here? Can they just raise your hands to be acknowledged? Any of them are here? They're probably in class. These kinds of global connections are part of what makes our college and university great. Our greatest strength in the College of Letters and Science is our diversity. I mean diversity in our cultures, our backgrounds, and our life experiences, as well as diversity in thoughts and our approaches to solving society's greatest challenges. We embrace our diversity while finding the common ground needed to move forward together. Today's talks will discuss some of the richness that comes from this kind of open engagement with each other. Alan, thank you so much for making this and so much of what you do at UC Davis possible. And thank you so much for also coming for every single event. That's for the last 3 years, I've always seen you sitting right there. So thank you for coming to support your faculty. I'll now turn it over to Michael Yonan, a professor and the Templeton Endowed Chair in Art History in our college and this year's colloquium organizer. Michael, thank you once again for organizing this special event, and thank you to our speakers, who I'm sure are going to entertain us for the next 1 hour or so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean Atakwana. It is my great pleasure to welcome you today to the 11th Templeton Colloquium in Art History at UC Davis. Look at the turnout. Incredible, wonderful. It is so great to see such a healthy community of students, scholars, and members of the broader populace here in UC Davis, and of course to welcome the guests that we have from out of town to enjoy today's topic. Our theme this year is Moving Things, Making Ideas, Chinese-Inspired Objects and International Trade. This topic allows us to think art historically about a country with which UC Davis has a special and strong relationship. In addition to regularly offering courses on East Asian art and culture and attracting students of Chinese and Chinese American heritage, as well as people who are just interested in China, I'm going to repeat what Dean Ataquana said, which is that this year the art history program is hosting 5, not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, but 5 visiting scholars from China who are researching here on fellowships from the China Scholarship Council. We are a department that rightly views China not as an artistic periphery, a culture interesting because of what other parts of the world say about it, but one central and important to global art history and history in its own right. You may know that the name of China in Chinese is Zhengguo, which means the central state. And that's how we approach it in our program, as one of the centers of artistic activity around the globe. The idea for today's event came about during several conversations with Professor Catherine Burnett, Chair of Art History and one of our speakers today. After many discussions in which we realized we were looking at 2 polar ends of the same artistic problem, in my case, the European reception of China, and in hers, Chinese ceramics that influenced things outside of China, we decided that a colloquium that examined the trade of objects and ideas in and out of China was worth holding. What we will see, I believe, is that the interconnected or global commercial character of the contemporary world, where so many things are made in China, or in which East Asian cultures influence aesthetic developments worldwide, is actually a situation with a long and fascinating history. And we'll touch on that history a little bit in today's talks. I'd like to say a few thanks. Thank you to my colleagues in the Department of Art and Art History and to the graduate students in our master's program. And particularly, I want to thank the grad students. We informally test the ideas for the annual colloquium on them, and they tell us what they think, sometimes rather bluntly. And so they are really essential for the process of thinking through what the annual colloquium is going to be. So we value their contribution enormously, and I want to acknowledge it here. Thanks as well to the leadership and staff of the Manetti Shrem Museum for their co-sponsorship of today's event, and of course to Dean Ataquana and her office for their tireless support of the arts at UC Davis, which is something that is wonderful to be at a university that has the kind of attention and appreciation for the arts that we have. I have to give huge thanks, and I don't know where she is right now, to Lisa Zadibel, who is one of the staff of art history and who is charged with being the coordinator of the colloquium. And I'm not kidding when I say that we literally couldn't do this without her. She does a lot of the work behind the scenes. Wherever you are, Lisa, you get my wholehearted thanks. And also thanks to Leah Tice, who is also part of the art history staff and helps out with this event in other important ways. And of course, we owe the greatest thanks to Alan Templeton, our benefactor, who is a true role model of how to be knowledgeable, enthusiastic, and conscientious in supporting the arts and humanities. Thank you, Alan. One note on procedure, I am going to introduce the third of our speakers, Professor Burnett, and the first 2 speakers will be introduced by 2 of our MA students, Cayetana Klinghoffer and Leah Kramer. So to start things off, Cayetana, where are you? Oh, there you are. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Yonan. I am pleased to present our first speaker, Tamara Bentley. Professor Bentley is a professor of art and Asian studies at Colorado College in Colorado Springs. Her research concerns the relationship between visual and literary values in 17th and 18th century Chinese and Japanese paintings and prints. She is the author of figurative works of Chen Hongshu, Authentic Voices, Expanding Markets, published by Routledge. She has been a visiting scholar at the National Central Art Academy in Beijing and a Fulbright scholar to Taiwan. Her paper today is titled Thinking Globally, 1660 to 1770, The Impact of Chinese Visual Commodities on English and French Material Culture. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Cayetana, for that kind introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here in this paradise-like and thought-provoking environment. And I want to express my thanks to Dean Atakwana and to Michael Yonan and Catherine Burnett, and of course to Alan Templeton. Thanks also to all of you for joining us here. It is truly a remarkable turnout. I'm very honored, and I'm sure that Christina and Catherine are as well. Let me just say that the most important part of my title is thinking globally. That's sort of the theme. And by the way, my Colorado College email is up there in red. You may not be able to see it. It's tbentley@coloradocollege.edu in case any of you want to reach out with thoughts at some point. And I'm going to set the timer so that I don't run over. That's very important. Start. Okay. Sorry. Start. Okay. And to begin, by way of establishing a leitmotif, we see on the left part of the screen a detail of two ducks from a room of Chinese wallpaper hung in 1752 at the British estate of Felbrigg Hall in Norfolk, and on the right, a panel of English wallpaper from about 1740, both of them picturing bird and flower motifs. Bird and flower was one of the traditional Chinese genres in art, alongside landscape painting, people painting, and religious imagery. These wallpapers are both print products. So if you look closely at the two ducks, you can see a break in the waves. That's where two different prints joined together. So they were created by woodblock prints and then hand colored. From a broad perspective, this exchange of novel products and motifs, in the case of bird and flower wallpaper from China to Europe, can be thought about by way of important work done by scholars of global design history, such as Maxine Berg. Berg, now retired, but originally part of a team of global historians at the University of Warwick, has written that imported Indian printed cottons and Chinese silks and wallpapers, as well as Chinese and Japanese lacquerwares and porcelains, jump-started the English and French domestic manufacturing of Asian-style textiles, japanned furniture, porcelains, and wallpapers as acts of import substitution. Berg prefers to say these are acts of creative adaptation, but in my mind, these are pretty straightforward cases of import substitution. In England, the increasing mechanization and standardization of these semi-luxury industries in turn provided key steps toward the Industrial Revolution. One might think of the gradual mechanization of textiles in England as a case in point. As both the source and the result of these developments in production, Berg argues for a uniquely, I'm underscoring uniquely because it's something I would dispute, a uniquely widespread commodity culture in 18th century England. So here we have a less zoomed in view of three of the panels of the Felbrigg Chinese bird and flower wallpaper. Although I agree with Berg's points about the impacts of Asian, particularly Chinese commodities in Europe, I'm uncomfortable with the fact that these East Asian goods seem to appear magically in England and France, since there's little consideration of the East Asian supply side regarding that trade. One of my key goals here is to expand our view of the mechanics and the ramifications of this trade in multiple, I'm underscoring multiple directions. I also find myself doubting the exceptionalism concerning widespread commodity culture in 18th century England, so I'll touch on evidence for extensive commodity cultures in 18th century China and Japan as well, something which frankly is not very hard to do. Last but not least, I'm also engaging here with recent scholarship concerning copy culture in early modern Europe. My aim for this dimension of the topic is to expand upon these interpretations of copy culture in order to analyze pictorial dynamics in East Asia and elsewhere as precipitated by global print circulation. That said, I'm looking at these topics in reverse order, beginning with the mechanics of copy culture. And to rein in that discussion, I'll mainly focus on Chinese lacquerwares and Chinese wallpaper, although other media such as porcelain could have been chosen. Let's turn first to Chinese lacquerwares in England. Both Japanese and Chinese lacquers were much valued in England as in other places. Here we see a Chinese incised lacquer folding screen. These are also called Coromandel lacquer screens because such screens were typically transported by way of India. They are also called quantities screens, a Chinese term meaning lacquer that was carved into and infilled with various colors. This Chinese screen is still held in the historic Ham House near London, and it must be dated 1680 or earlier, since the household inventory specifies an India screen in 1680. As many of you know, there was a lot of slippage between references to India and East Asia in Europe at this time. The composition shows European figures under a white tent at upper center. The lower section of the screen pictures Europeans and their associates hunting fantastical and demonic creatures. In this detail, we see below the central ornamental tent one seated figure wearing a gold-colored Western crown and playing a lute, and behind him a woman and a boy holding a rosary. Though this screen was made in China, I would suggest that the imagery of the crown, the Catholic rosary, and the colorful ankle-length trousers and floppy hats worn by the figures relate to earlier Japanese Nanban imagery, that is, imagery of the Catholic, Portuguese, and Spanish in Japan from 1543 to 1639. I'm showing on the right a section of a Japanese printed folding screen depicting turbaned or crowned European rulers on horseback, a motif the Japanese artist adopted from the upper section of a Netherlandish printed map brought by the Jesuits. The resuscitation of Japanese Nanban imagery in a Chinese product approximately 70 years later is one unexpected valence regarding this early Chinese Coromandel screen in England. This is one example of the multi-part visual referencing I'll be investigating throughout this talk. Let's look at the impact of such lacquers in England. In Britain in 1688, two authors, Stalker and Parker, produced a printed book compiling chinoiserie designs that could be painted on japanned furniture. Japanning was the English term for painting and varnishing furniture to look like lacquer. The upper three images here are all from the Stalker and Parker Japanning book. This treatise on Japanning was directed at two audiences: cultured young women desiring a productive leisure activity, and furniture makers engaged in the commercial business. Advertisements placed in London newspapers stated that Stalker and Parker's printed book of Japanning techniques and designs could be purchased in London or in Edinburgh at the shops of booksellers who were specified. Historians note in examples such as this the escalating use of advertising, or we might even say PR. As I'm illustrating here, Stalker and Parker seem to take some of their images from the Dutchman Linschoten's Itinerario travel book, circa 1595 to 6, on the lower right. Some images from the Dutch adventurer Nieuwhoff's An Embassy of the East India Company to China, 1665, on the lower left, and even some from the Japanese printed motif manual, seen in the lower center, from 1683. I'll just point out that the man in this sort of torture device is copied from here to here. The crane bending down is copied from here to here. and this bamboo on the left with a mangrove-like tree to the right of it seems to be copied as well. For this cobbling together process, I'll use the term modular, meaning a self-contained unit that can be combined or interchanged with others like it to create different designs. A mix and match method is being utilized by Stalker and Parker and also employed in the new items made from such motif books. So here, to show how these printed motifs were picked up, we have one 18th century British lacquered cabinet, now held in Schloss Charlottenburg in Germany, which displays verbatim, as it were, one of the Stalker and Parker designs seen off to the right. Let's now look at some of the studio techniques applied in Chinese lacquer workshops. Copying from one Chinese screen to another is everywhere apparent. The two Chinese screens pictured here share many border objects. On the right, we see a Coromandel screen with an estate reception scene in the center and a series of objects called the 100 Antiquities on all four borders. At the far left, you see the left border of a different Coromandel screen held in Copenhagen. We observe that the left borders of the two screens are nearly identical, certainly in the sequence of objects. So this left border and this left border have nearly identical objects, although they're sometimes treated slightly differently in their execution. It's possible that the Chinese craftsmen have utilized pouncing, where a linear image on paper is punched with holes along each line through which a colored powder is forced onto a secondary surface and then once more drawn together. Alternatively, the craftsman could have used atelier pattern books, prints, or stencils. Now I'm going to give you a sort of palette cleanser with a blank slide for a second. The way in which the central images in Chinese quantities screens and the borders are recombined in new and novel fashions intersects with some of the recent scholarship on copy culture in the 16th and 17th centuries in the Netherlands. As Edward Wouk points out, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, W-O-U-K, the pervasiveness of printed copies of paintings in the 16th century led the Flemish painter Frans Floris to adopt a flexible view toward painted copies of paintings within his own studio. These painted copies of an original became less exact reiterations and more variations on a theme. This was to distinguish the duplicate paintings from the more dutiful replications seen in prints. As Wouk puts it, the duplicate paintings produced in Floris's studio by assistants were appealing precisely for their, quote, interplay of sameness and difference, end quote. I'm still working through how differences in copy cultures may have played out in different cultural settings, but I find this difference within sameness art to be an intriguing observation, and it usefully applies to lacquer screens. Now I'd like to turn to Chinese wallpaper in England. As shown in our first and second slides, at Felbrigg Hall, there still remains a so-called Chinese guest room, which displays an alternating group of Chinese bird and flower printed panels put up in 1752. Some of the same printed panels found their way to the stately home Item Moat, also installed in about 1750 on the right. As we see here, a Chinese studio might utilize the same wood blocks to produce multiple sets of wallpapers. The manner in which they were hand painted was nevertheless quite distinctive. Here we can see that not only in their Chinese production, but also in their English installation, a modular process was used. In order to fit the dimensions of the room, British paper hangers would cut out parts of other wallpapers, or in some cases, single sheet prints, to extend the scene toward the bottom, as we see in the Felbrigg works. And I'll show you another image of this here in a minute. Or they sometimes move motifs to new spots as needed, generating new compositions. We see considerable rearrangement in the item moat panels. For example, a garden rock that was originally at the bottom is moved to the mid section, and they've inserted a crane, although it's somewhat at a smaller scale. So if we look carefully at these Felbrigg examples in the room, there's more than one case in which they put up the same bird and flower wallpaper. So it's kind of mix and match, that some birds appear more than once. And towards the bottom, they had to put a different paper down to extend it. So there's, first of all, an obvious break between one panel and another, and then this part is all cut and placed in as a separate scene. And you can even see the axe cut strokes that are used in this landscape wallpaper, which is a traditional Chinese landscape form of brushwork. But they all somehow seem to blend together. And this view of the bedroom at Felbrigg shows that the canopy bed with the upper textile removed allows us to see the trees and the darting birds, creating a lovely outdoors feeling in the interior. Having examined aspects of copy culture rather extensively, I'd like now to briefly turn to the interwovenness of commercial networks in the East Asian circuits in order to show the multiple cultural overlappings in this commercial climate. Regarding the 17th century, the historian James K. Chin explains how Dutch merchants in Batavia, the Dutch trade base on the island of Java in Indonesia, here, relied on Chinese Hokkien merchants from Fujian to guarantee their insurance for particular shipping expeditions. We see a painted view of Batavia at the lower left here. As we reach 1700, escalating restrictions placed by the Edo period Japanese government on shipping through Nagasaki meant that European and Chinese trade with Japan gradually lessened, just as European trade through the southern Chinese port of Canton or Guangzhou picked up. You see a map diagramming some of these Asian trade routes and two paintings on the right of the port of Canton. The boats gathered by the factories and packing tea for export. You also see a British merchant and a Chinese merchant conversing over this transaction. Scholar Paul van Dyck describes the little-known fact that Chinese Canton merchants, called Hong merchants, occasionally borrowed money from Europeans who seemed to have more ready capital than the Chinese. Although these trade relationships could and should be further fleshed out, to my mind, the extent to which merchants of different nationalities borrowed from and profited from each other greatly nuances the allegiances to national identity we might presume. In addressing Maxine Berg's elevation of British 18th century consumer culture, what can we say of consumer cultures in China and Japan in this era? The two large Coromandel screens, whose nearly identical borders I pointed out, were both produced for domestic patrons in China, not for export, though they were later transported to the West. In quite a few cases, inscriptions on lacquer screens show that a scholarly group purchased the item to honor a teacher, or a household purchased a screen for a celebration. This provides one clue to the thriving Chinese market for semi-luxury goods. And the Jingdezhen painting on the left seems to speak for itself in terms of manual mass production. This is painted by Ding Guanpeng, Sun You, and Zhou Kun. It's part of a series called Porcelain Production at Jingdezhen. In Japan, printed evidence tells us that by the mid-1600s, woodblock printed books showing designs for kasode, or form of kimono, were available for women to look at in selecting a cutting-edge pattern, rather like printed or online clothing catalogs today. You see one printed kasode pattern book from Japan here, dated 1667. It's in the Metropolitan Museum. Middle-class people at kabuki theater events competed with each other blatantly in the finery of their attire. Some paintings, such as the Matsura screen on the upper right, that's part of the screen, have been spoken of as advertisements for available kimono patterns. My point here is that the commodification of 18th century Chinese and Japanese culture shows little sign of being behind the times compared to England. To conclude, modular or mix and match craft construction was not new in the 17th and 18th centuries. In fact, the Chinese Qin dynasty emperor had a whole terracotta army built for his tomb in semi-modular fashion in 206 BCE. What is new in the 17th and 18th centuries, however, is the level of interface between print cultures, allowing for the borrowing and reconfiguring of cross-cultural imagery at a scale never seen before. What is also new is the sizable extent across these cultures of the middle and upper middle class market. I agree with Maxine Berg that Asian commodities, and particularly Chinese export commodities, had an enormous impact on England and France, generating a taste for semi-luxuries such as lacquer, porcelain, and wallpaper. The development of European industries manufacturing these goods went a long way toward building domestic mass production in England, which by the end of the 18th century included mechanization. However, it was not only the British who applied their ingenuity to reproducing these desirable goods. The modular way in which multiples were made in China, for example, in Kwansai lacquer screens or wallpaper studios, was not a draconian or old-fashioned process, as some scholars have suggested. It was already full of cross-genres and experimental reconfiguring. The flourishing trade in these products, as well as the monetized economic system of which this trade was a part, generated a commodity culture in China and Japan every bit as extensive as that in 18th century England. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Our next speaker is Christina Klukin. She is David W. Musker Associate Professor of Art History and Archaeology at Washington University in St. Louis. She's a specialist in Chinese art of the Ming and Qing dynasties, including painting and print culture, Sino-foreign interactions, the imperial court, and the relationship between art and science. She has received fellowships from the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Getty Research Institute, among others. She is the author of Imperial Illusions, Crossing Pictorial Boundaries in the Qing Palaces, published by University of Washington Press. Her paper today is titled Mutual Influences, Painted Enamels on Kangxi's Yixing Ware and Butker Stoneware. Please join me in welcoming Professor Klukin.
Good afternoon. So I have to tell you, I'm so excited and grateful to be here. At WashU, I'm actually the Director of Undergraduate Studies for Art History, and the UC Davis MA program is one I recommend to our students all the time. So just to let the dean know here. But also, you know, and it occurred to me as I was finishing up this talk that I'm sharing a podium with 3 scholars who show up on multiple syllabi all at the same time. Michael Yonan, Tamara Bentley, and Catherine Burnett. So I kind of feel like I should have come with syllabus copies for you, so you could see that this is actually true. And finally, I was delighted this afternoon to learn not just that Alan Templeton is a friend to the humanities and to art history, but he also has a particular love for the 18th century, which happens to be my favorite too. So with that in place, Leah, thank you so much for the generous introduction. And this year, I am delighted to participate in the Templeton Colloquium and to be on stage with other scholars whose work that I use and admire. And today, I'd like to engage with the Templeton theme of moving things and making ideas with a case study that also explores not just what such movement and making means when Chinese objects travel outside of China, but are also transformed by that experience and then continue their journey by returning home again, traveling round trip rather than just one way. Enameled red stoneware was technically and aesthetically novel at the early 18th century courts of both Augustus II the Strong, Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, and the Qing Dynasty Emperor Kangxi. These two contemporary rulers were both deeply interested in and supportive of technological and aesthetic innovations in their court workshops, and fascinated by each other's decorative arts and achievements. At precisely the same time, namely the first quarter of the 18th century, both of these rulers sponsored research and development into replicating luxury materials distinctive to each other's decorative arts. Specifically, in Saxony, the production of Chinese-style red stoneware and hard-paste porcelain, meaning true porcelain, and in Beijing, the production of European-style painted enamelwares. In both cases, the technology and the aesthetics were inseparable from the desired finished product. No endings will be spoiled by telling you that both rulers succeeded, and those topics have been very well studied. However, the role played by red stoneware in both cases has largely been subordinated to that of porcelain, even when enamels on metal are considered to even resemble porcelain, as you see here on the right. So what I'd like to do today is reorient our focus back to stoneware, and specifically to the subset of enameled stoneware, through which we discover not only a case of multi-directional inspirations, but also a tantalizing new avenue for research into the cross-pollination that occurred between 18th century China and German decorative arts. So let's first clarify the major differences between stoneware and porcelain, which for stoneware means a lower firing temperature that results in an opaque body, a dull sound when tapped, and clay that is only partially vitrified. For the sake of the museum, I'm going to advise you not to walk into a museum and go flicking the ceramics. That will definitely not go well. But if you were an 18th century consumer and connoisseur, that sonic experience is part of identifying the difference. Our particular red stoneware falls into the category of Yixingware, named after the site in Jiangsu province with rich deposits of deep reddish brown, especially zisha clay. Yixing red stoneware began its journey in the early 16th century from Jiangsu province at Yixing, rather than from the Jingdezhen kilns that dominated proto-porcelain and porcelain production since the 11th century. Yixingware, originating from the city of the same name in Jiangsu, was notably different from porcelain, not just because of all those material differences the slide just outlined, but also because among the three most influential kiln sites that produced European export ceramics, namely the Jingdezhen, Dehua, and Yixing kiln sites, only the Yixing kilns produced stoneware instead of porcelain, and occasionally in the form of scholars' objects, but most often teawares. These restrained works are typically ornamented not with painting, but rather they are carved, they are molded, they are incised patterns. The high iron content of the clay used for colored Yixingwares means that they could not be wheel thrown. And so again, they were sculpted by hand, often by one craftsman rather than by the many artisans required by the specialized division of labor required for porcelain production at Jingdezhen. And consequently, many Yixingwares bear the craftsman's name, while porcelains do not. The movement of Chinese Yixingware to Europe likely began sometime during the second quarter of the 17th century and increased when the Jingdezhen kilns, which are the primary kilns for both imperial and export porcelain, ceased production amid the turmoil of the dynastic transition from the Ming to Qing dynasties. During this period in the mid-17th century, Europe sought its Chinese ceramics elsewhere, specifically on the one hand through Japanese porcelain kilns that imitated Chinese export wares and created new styles, as well as smaller independent Chinese kilns that produced other wares, such as Yixing. An Yixingware teapot may well have been part of the Danish Royal Cabinet of Curiosities as early as 1656, but by the 1670s, Dutch and English potters were advertising their own red porcelain. Note that term here, red porcelain teapots for sale that were considered at least as good as imported wares. Increasingly refined Dutch red wares, such as those by Arie de Mild or the brothers David and John Philip Ehlers, continue to imitate Chinese Yixingwares before European hard-paste porcelain replaced them in quantity and desirability in the 18th century. During the last quarter of the 17th century, however, European interest had therefore increased dramatically with regard to Yixing red stoneware, where the novelty of both its material and its associations with the new custom of tea drinking invited what the porcelain scholar Claire Le Corbeiller has termed translation into the Chinese-inspired teawares produced in Northern Europe, such as at Meissen. Butger stoneware, Meissen stoneware here, is an imitation of Chinese Yixingware produced approximately 1710 to 1713 at the Meissen manufactory, according to a formula developed somewhere between 1706 and 1708 by the German alchemist and inventor Johann Friedrich Butger, together with fellow scientists. Butger's formula involved mixing red bolus, or what's called Nuremberg earth, with local clay and slurry, then firing at the unusually high temperature of 1100 degrees Celsius. A fine red clay containing ferric oxide, red bolus was considered both medicinal, if used for pills and unglazed vessels. Sounds tasty. As well as alchemically connected with gold by its dark red color. And both of these features indicate greater significance for the finished objects than their otherwise unassuming matte red material might suggest. Butger's well-known success in hard-paste white porcelain with transparent glaze actually developed out of his efforts to imitate Yixingware, resulting in a stoneware sufficiently hard and dense that it could be cut and polished on a lathe in the manner of gemstone carving and jewelry making. In March 1709, Butger formally declared to his patron or jailer, you choose the word, Augustus II the Strong, of his invention of, and here I quote, a red, very fine vessel, which is equal to East Asian so-called red porcelain in every respect, together with Europe's true hard-paste white porcelain that's been widely studied, and so we're just going to leave that aside. Augustus II decreed the founding of the Royal Porcelain Manufactory in Dresden in January of 1710, moved it to Albrechtsburg Castle in Meissen for security in June of the same year, although it should be said here that Butger, despite being named the manufactory's director, remained in Dresden with only occasional visits permitted to Meissen. During the first few years of the 1710s, Meissen primarily produced Butger's red stoneware in forms inspired by European silver, Chinese and Japanese porcelain, Chinese Yixingware, and Dutch redware by Arie de Mild. These connections and their transformations can be seen in a Butger stoneware teapot datable to 1710 or 1712 that is additionally decorated with enamels whose application is attributed to the Dresden court enameler Johann Martin Meyer. This teapot is partially cut and wheel polished, but its relief molded decoration of leaves and blossoms raised slightly above the vessel's surface is drawn directly from late Ming and early Qing examples. Here, I should tell you that the process differs. This item was cast in a mold rather than having the designs hand-shaped and applied to the surface, as it would have been in China. The addition of painted enamels, although occasionally found on 17th century Dutch and English earthen redwares, is inextricable from Meissen production. Adding painted enamel dramatically increased the cost of these objects, meaning not only an additional firing to fix the enamels to the stoneware substrate, but for Augustus II, it also meant paying for the services of the elite Dresden court enamelers, not just Meyer, but also Georg Friedrich Dinglinger, and their work typically appears on metalware. The extraordinary resources of the Dresden court and its patron meant that Butker stoneware also began to incorporate other luxury materials into its decoration, including gilding and inlays of precious stones, in addition to painted enamels. In early 1710, the number of luxury specialists employed at the Dresden factory demonstrates the relationship between ceramics manufacture and luxury goods at that court. And those specialists amounted to 9 potters, 2 gold workers, 2 silversmiths, 3 enamelers, 2 painters, 1 glass painter, 2 stone cutters, and 14 glass cutters and polishers. Their work was well represented in decorated Meissen products intended for the May 1710 Leipzig Easter Fair, which marked the first major public purchase opportunity for Butker stoneware. Butker also stole his stonewares through independent merchants who carried his wares to fairs in places such as Naumburg, Berlin, Augsburg, and Vienna, with additional plans to access Dutch and French markets. Less than 6 months later, in October of 1710, Butker's secretary and the Meissen factory inspector, Johann Melchior Steinbruck, he reported back from an audience with Augustus II that, and I quote again, "the red polished ware pleased him greatly." And, meaning but, he expressed the idea that they did not want in the future to make so much of the polished wares, but to reserve them only for gifts to great potentates, such as for his cousin, King Frederick IV of Denmark, who received some in 1711. The potential healing properties, color association with gold, and later addition of gilded decoration on some Butker stonewares likely contributed to their suitability as gifts to other royals and high nobles. Yet in October of 1710, still the first year in which the Meissen manufactory operated, and less than 6 months after the Easter Fair, Augustus II deemed painted enamel stonewares cost prohibitive, saying that future decoration in relief only would be best because the enameling was more valuable than the stoneware itself. The short period of limited production means that luxury decorated Butker stoneware, which includes enameled stoneware, does not survive in the same quantities as unenameled works. After Butker's death, Augustus II appropriated his inventor's stoneware stock and integrated it both into his famous Japanese palace in Dresden, which inventoried 318 stoneware pieces in 1721, as well as into his treasury at the Dresden Palace, known then as the Privy Repository and later, perhaps more famously, the Green Vault. Also inventoried in the Green Vault was an early Qing imperial painted enamel yellow snuff bottle with a Chinese landscape in red monochrome enamel. This bottle, I believe, creates an important connection between Beijing and Saxony in the early 18th century. Monochrome landscapes in colors other than cobalt blue or grisaille are extremely rare in Chinese art, in both decorative arts and paintings. Monochrome puce or red landscapes, especially landscapes with European architecture, began to appear in Chinese painted enamels, actually more often in the 1730s, and become a regular feature in the second half of the 18th century. Yet this snuff bottle suggests that European enamel painting in red or puce in a monochrome palette or en camailleux such as Böttger and Dinglinger succeeded in creating using colloidal gold red glass at Meissen during the 1710s, may well also have arrived at the Kangxi court during the formative period of High Qing painted enamel development. Scientific and stylistic analysis, together with archival research, has identified this snuff bottle as a very rare Kangxi period work that is documented in Europe during the first phase of High Qing painted enamel production from the first quarter of the 18th century. The Kangxi court term for painted enamels, hua falang, uses an established term for enamels, again, falang, that historically connoted foreign origin and acquired a particular connection with France, actually around 1700. Painted enamels distinguishes the 18th century technique from cloisonné, which is believed to have been introduced into China from either Byzantium or the Islamic world, whether in the Yuan dynasty, so late 13th, early 14th centuries, but then became a quintessentially Chinese Ming dynasty court art. Nevertheless, late Ming and early Qing collection and connoisseurship manuals regularly invoked the foreign origins of falang as a category, and during the Kangxi reign, the term falang acquired additional foreign connection to France, whose ships were called falan, Western ships, falan as a transliteration of France, brought enamels and enamel materials to the port of Guangzhou, known to Europeans as Canton. Although Kangxi had been interested in European enamels since the 1680s, only after 1700, and likely more specifically after 1710, did his patronage of research, experimentation, and production result in works that earned imperial reign marks, signifying imperial approval. The color palette of the snuff bottle epitomizes the new palette that the material of painted enamels brought into Chinese arts, decorative court arts at the beginning of the 18th century. Scientific analysis has revealed the chemical composition of these colors and therefore also the places from which they arrived at the Qing court, specifically opaque white from lead arsenate, with the arsenic presented as tribute from Shandong, pink from gold nanoparticles, a formula acquired from Guangdong enamelers, not the European colloidal gold formulation, multiple tones of yellow created with a variety of compounds, but significantly a cool-toned lemony yellow from imported lead antimonate, and a deep blue from cobalt, either cobalt, both Asian and European, or from imported Saxon smalt, a point to which I will return later. Painted enamels were applied onto 4 substrates at the Kangxi court: glass, metal, porcelain, and yixingware. Yixing was a significant departure from past precedent for imperial aesthetic tastes in ceramics, given that this material previously did not play much of a role in imperial collections, nor was there significant court-sponsored production, and no formal imperially sponsored yixingware kiln in Jiangsu, which was a contrast from at Jingdezhen. Nor was it produced in the Beijing imperial workshops, where all of this enameling was done. Today, there exist 20 painted enamel stonewares connected to the Kangxi emperor. 1 teapot at the top left remains in the Forbidden City as part of the former imperial collections of the Palace Museum in Beijing. The remaining 19 are held in the former imperial collection at the National Palace Museum in Taipei, including 12 covered teacups of approximately the same design and pattern, 2 bowls, and 5 teapots. All 20 of these works were produced in the first quarter of the 18th century, specifically before the Kangxi emperor's death in 1722. The earliest likely experimental work incorporates a similar pattern to that commonly seen in Europe at the time. Its flowers, butterflies, and auspicious fruits are predominantly yellow, pale blue, deep green, and reddish pink, without any underlying molded decoration, although the thickness of the enamel application raises some of the motifs slightly above the object's surface. The painting style and the enamel application are both notably awkward, but both the style and the auspicious fruits and flowers design anticipates the more elegant and refined work of later Kangxi period enameled yixingware. The teapot is datable to the Kangxi reign not only because of the chronology of painted enamel development, but also thanks to a base inscription, datable to the 8th lunar month of 1705, that attributes the vessel to one Xiaobang Yu, the maker whose dates are unknown. And that makes it likely that this teapot resulted from an experiment in applying painted enamels to an object that Kangxi already owned. Kangxi's painted enamels reached their apex during the period 1716 to 1722 with works that show a marked evolution occurring at top speed. By the end of his reign, painting was fluid and clear, the pigments themselves are opaque and bright, and the finished works considered so successful that they were not only given Kangxi imperial reign marks, but also collected by his grandson, the Qianlong Emperor, into a highly curated group of painted enamels on all substrates that is still considered a potted history of their development at the Qing court. Unlike the other substrates, which include a range of forms, including vases, ewers, dishes, and more, the Yixing wares are all teawares, and they leave that substrate far more visible than any other material used in early Chinese painted enamels. Scholars disagree about the style of flower painting on these Yixing wares. Assessments range from Chinese style derived from Tang or Song models, patterns drawn from traditional textiles, European styles inspired by material exchange, and direct connections to the work of 18th century Jesuit missionary Giuseppe Castiglione. Nevertheless, everyone agrees that the flowers themselves are a mix of Chinese and European blooms, drawn from nature as well as imagination. A new incorporation is the increased presence of blue flowers, found on all of the enameled Yixing wares and most, if not all, of the other substrates as well. This color in particular deserves more study for the connections it creates between Saxony and Beijing. Scientific analysis has again demonstrated that this blue was created from imported European cobalt thanks to a particular chemical composition vastly different from Chinese sourced cobalt, which was only used in underglazed blue enamels. And that strongly suggests the ore mountains in Saxony as the original source. European cobalt ore has been identified in overglazed Japanese enamels from the second half of the 17th century, offering important evidence for the presence of smalt in the region, despite a general lack of archival documentation for its importation during the Kangxi reign. And Saxon cobalt was most frequently exported as smalt, a pre-prepared cobalt-bearing silicate glass that European documentary evidence proves was imported by multiple East India companies into China during the 18th century. Available from Guangzhou and Beijing, yet still 1/10 the price of local cobalt, imported smalt may well have been cheaper. It had been used in painting as a common and economical substitute for azurite and ultramarine, and the Dutch had produced smalt in significant quantities since the mid-16th century. Qing use of imported smalt likely derived, therefore, I believe, from Saxon cobalt, which dominated the European market, meaning that Kangxi's enamelers in China, if this is what they were using the same material as the enamelers at Meissen used until at least 1725. All of Kangxi's patronage of the development of painted enamels in his court workshops exists in relation to his fascination with European technologies and aesthetics, but also in relation to how he integrated what was useful and adapted when necessary. France has been given the most consideration in regard to this work because of the direct exchanges between Kangxi and Louis XIV that were mediated through the Jesuits under French royal sponsorship, but not as official ambassadors. It is a fine but important distinction. But Augustus II sent neither diplomatic nor trade missions to the Kangxi court, and there were no East India companies based in what we might today consider Germany. So how does this stuff get there? Several German courts were intermarried with other European courts that did have East India companies, namely Dutch, English, French, Danish, and Swedish. And consequently, Christian Hertel has argued that both culturally and economically, courtly chinoiserie in the German lands is often concerned with locally and regionally grounded intra-European interests in East-West or China-Europe relations. These intra-European relationships that created connections between Saxony and Beijing, I believe, are the most likely and most logical routes by which such special works such as Augsburg enamels and Meissen enameled stoneware may have arrived in China. The role of East India companies in facilitating this exchange also includes the role of private exchange in moving such things without a clear paper trail, because Butker stonewares with painted enamels are not currently known to be mentioned in period Chinese sources. Despite the increasing study of cross-cultural artistic exchange and the global interactions of material culture, technological transfer, and stylistic evolution, there is still a tendency to trace a straight line of movement, from an original to a copy to a version to a hybrid, and so on, from one place to another, with a single point each of departure and arrival. The practice of painting colored and gold enamels on Yixing ware in certain distinctive patterns offers a case where the exoticizing court works may well have been inspired by Chinese works transformed in Europe and then returned to the Qing in form of Butker enameled stoneware. Painted enamels on Yixing ware seem to have been limited to the Kangxi era and perhaps correspondingly have received the least discussion in Chinese scholarship relative to enamels on metal and porcelain, and even less in English. Nevertheless, close study of this group in relation to the most recent scholarship on painted enamels reveals the pace and possibilities of mutual influence between China and Europe in the first 2 decades of the 18th century, as well as connections between Beijing and Saxony that deserve greater exploration. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, our third speaker is one of our very own, Catherine Burnett, Professor of Chinese Art here at UC Davis and founding director of the UC Davis Global Tea Institute. She's the author of 2 books and numerous articles on early modern Chinese art. One of her books, Dimensions of Originality, Essays on 17th Century Chinese Art Theory and Criticism, has recently appeared in a Mandarin language translation. She has 2 recent articles of note, one on contemporary 17th century contemporaneity in 17th century Chinese painting, which just appeared in the journal Ming Studies, and another on weird figure paintings that is forthcoming in the journal Artibus Asiae. In founding the Global Tea Institute, she has created a fantastic venue for the study of tea in all of its cultural, historical, culinary, and scientific complexity. And if that sounds interesting, check out their website for a schedule of events and courses that they sponsor. Her paper today is entitled Art History Without the Art, The Curious Case of Sino-Vietnamese Teapots Before 1700.
All righty then. Michael, thank you very much for that very gracious and generous introduction. And wow. Kudos to my colleagues who gave these brilliant talks. I can't wait to have discussions with you both with overlap, like left, right, and center, that I'm excited to talk with you about. And also, you know, you guys are on the syllabus for my spring quarter seminar. So I really can't wait. This just tickles me no end that this is this topic and you guys did what you did. So today I want to share my research on art history without the art, the curious case of Sino-Vietnamese teapots before 1700. I will begin by explaining some of the limiting factors that give focus to this project. First, the teapot. The teapot is important both as a shape and as an artifact. I focus on the shape to excavate an aspect of Vietnam's cultural history vis-a-vis its neighbor to the north, China. Because the teapot is a complex and unique form, it is possible to use it to reveal more of Vietnam's art and cultural history, and through this, to establish an aspect of Chinese-style tea culture there. Next, the dates. For this project, I'm looking at teapots produced between about 1391 to about 1700. Why 1391? Because it was in that year that the first Ming emperor declared that the powdered tea pounded into cakes used for whisked tea, the commonplace style of tea preparation at the time, put too much strain on the laborers. He was concerned. He did not want to accept that kind of tea anymore as tribute, and he only wanted to accept the loose leaf, whole leaf tea as tribute. From that point forth, China's tea preparation and tea culture changed. Steeped tea became the dominant form of tea as beverage in China and ultimately around the world, and teapots became a necessary tool for preparation. I end my study in about 1700 because teapot shapes then became so normative that tea sets were standardized. At that point, there isn't a question about what they looked like or if Chinese-style tea culture existed in Vietnam or elsewhere. The about 1700 terminus is reinforced by this 18th century Vietnamese hanging scroll in which a military mandarin pauses to share a cup of tea. In the detail on the left, a tea set for the group is clearly laid out on a low table. And by Vietnam, I mean the state of Dai Viet, or Dai Yue, the Great Viet, that political region of northern Vietnam that was populated early by Chinese settlers from the southern Zhou dynasty state of Yue, who fled the Qin armies during Qin's ruthless campaign of conquest and consolidation. Dai Viet is distinct from southern Vietnam, Champa, which had closer ties to regions to Vietnam's west. A few reasons why it is reasonable to expect a shared tea culture at all is because China and Vietnam shared a land border. Borders are porous. And China occupied Vietnam from 111 BCE to 980 CE, and again from 1407 to 1424, years that proved to be formative and transformative to major developments in China's tea culture. Even though China's control may have been uneven across time, through its political dominion, China spread its social, cultural, and political values to Vietnam, including that of tea culture, a type of culture that is wrapped up in the social and the political. And also, from at least the 10th century, Vietnam practiced Chinese-style tea culture with tea bowls that they made based on Chinese examples, as well as tea ewers, as the one in the top left from the 11th or 12th century. The Chinese model, is on the right. In texts, Vietnamese aristocracy referred to China as the home of tea. Indeed, as I will discuss, Vietnam had many strong political and cultural ties to China that it maintained then and later for its own sovereign survival. Based on this and other supporting evidence, I argue that Vietnam would have continued to follow China's styles of tea culture and developed its own Chinese-style teapots in the 14th to 17th centuries. Now, back to the art history with the art part of the title, I have to admit that although I thought this was going to be a fast and easy research project. I'd just get some books on Chinese art and Chinese and Vietnamese ceramics, locate and compare a few teapots, explain the evidence, and be done. I soon discovered otherwise. Surprisingly, the plethora of teapots that I expected to find just have not shown up. In fact, spoiler alert, in my continuing examination of all the books on early Vietnamese ceramics and archaeological finds in the extensive UC libraries that I could get my hands on, including those through interlibrary loan, and then repeated research trips to Vietnamese museums and antique galleries and private collections, the only Chinese-style teapot that I have found from this transformative early period that was made in Vietnam is the one on the screen. It is in the museum collection of the Thanh Long Imperial Citadel, Hanoi, a site in the imperial capital that served as both imperial residence and bureaucratic center for centuries. Nonetheless, I have found substantial corroborative evidence, historical, political, cultural, material, and visual, to support a strongly reasoned claim for a new Chinese-style steeped tea culture in Vietnam at this time. But first, why teapots? How can teapots be so important and so informative? The answer is a complicated relationship of why a teapot equals when a teapot equals what a teapot is, and from that, where a teapot, and then what is tea culture? This comparative study of tea ware gives me the opportunity to consider a neglected area of art history while also engaging with issues of border crossing. Preliminary findings already suggest that the Sino-Viet tea trade may well have had an even broader impact, both global and local, that is to say, the impact on global localization. Given the evidence at hand, I take some comfort from the need for this kind of study that has been pointed out by John Guy, curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as he has asserted, quote, intensive comparative study between Vietnamese ceramics and contemporaneous Chinese ceramics must be addressed
Doing this permits informed analysis of style, which draws on the extensive body of knowledge of Chinese ceramics development, especially as this relates to problems of dating, unquote. And as John Guy has further noted, quote, the ethno-historical knowledge of Vietnamese culture is little examined, unquote. Not only is this still true, Guy was writing in the 1990s, but even less has been done that focuses on Vietnamese tea culture and tea ware and before 1700. To be sure, research has been done on Chinese and Southeast Asian trade routes, shipwrecks, and other excavated ceramics. Research has not been done, however, that focuses on this early modern tea trade and tea ware. The study of tea ware in the region for this period is still very new. And although quite a bit has been written about the Vietnamese ceramics when compared to other Southeast Asian states, experts on Southeast Asia argue that Vietnamese ceramics are nonetheless grossly understudied. For that matter, in general, tea studies are also greatly understudied. And so I am particularly grateful to you guys for bringing in teapots. So as world interest in studies of tea and tea cultures are growing rapidly, this project is timely. But first, why focus only on teapots? Why not also consider tea bowls or teacups? As much as these shapes also can be distinctive, they offer different stories. Likewise, Vietnamese objects adapted for tea by other countries, such as these Vietnamese vessels used for tea ceremony in Japan, also are excluded from this study. They likewise tell a different story. My interest is in the objects that were made specifically for tea service in Vietnam or China and for Vietnamese tea consumption in accordance with the 1391 Ming Dictate for loose leaf tea and the consequent new fashion for steep tea culture. To be sure, I recognize there are also non-China-based tea cultures in Vietnam with their own important histories, but that also is a separate project. My research focuses on the Sino-Viet tea tradition. One last thing before I share my evidence, exactly what is a teapot? What could a teapot look like in the early Ming? It turns out that the features in the earliest teapots are familiar because for ceramic ware in this time, form followed function. Typically, the features are a round shape. Because a shape as close to spherical as possible has the least amount of surface area by volume, it is the best shape for maintaining the temperature necessary to prepare tea, while also being suitable to serve it. For stability, teapots have a flat bottom, no foot, a short spout rising up level with the opening at the neck, a handle at the back that pulls away from the vessel and allows for a hand to hold the pot securely and comfortably without burning the fingers on the side. A neck opening, even with the top of the spout, a wide mouth that opens and allows for input and removal of tea leaves, and a secure lid. Though the form can take many shapes and inventive shapes, as indicated by the chart on the right, the vessel is almost always recognizable as a teapot. Our 16th century Vietnamese example on the left shares these features. Its potter modeled it on Chinese models, as on the right. On the right is the prized teapot with overhead loop handle that was excavated from the tomb of eunuch Wu Jing, who died in 1533 in Nanjing, the Ming state's southern political and cultural capital. Its iconic shape shows up repeatedly in various Ming Dynasty paintings. One is in this detail from Wang Wen's hand scroll, The Artist Brewing Tea of 1558. Because both handles loop up above the vessel, these pots could also function as kettles. The teapot shape did not come from out of nowhere, but appears to be based on a relatively unacknowledged type of wine vessel that is both squat and round, and with a small loop handle on the back. This shape was later copied by Vietnamese potters, as on the screen. So the Vietnamese examples are in the middle and on the right. The small, close handle on the back indicates that the temperature of the liquid inside, while warmed, permitted close contact with the fingers. These pots would not have contained hot tea. To preserve the alcohol levels, wine would be warmed, but not heated to a high degree like tea. Indeed, from soon after the Imperial Ming Edict in 1391, teapots emerged in China and in the prototypical teapot shape. These vessels are from the Yongle period, a period during which Vietnam was ruled by China starting in 1407 and for 20 years. In other words, from virtually the same time that the Ming state controlled Vietnam and the time when, as far as I can tell, teapots were invented. Consequently, it is reasonable to expect to find teapots in and from Vietnam at least as early as the beginning of the 15th century, and we should expect them to look like this. Yet so far, this is the only one, made in Vietnam and before 1700. This vessel is important not only because it is unique, but it is also important because of its find spot. According to museum labels, it was excavated at the Thang Long Imperial Citadel, the site of the imperial palace and residence, for centuries. Ceramics were made there and in its environs, and of course used there. Archaeological excavations continue to uncover important ceramic objects there, all of very high quality. Now, it might be tempting to dismiss this teapot, though, because it is only unglazed stoneware, not the higher prestige porcelain. Maybe it's only kitchenware, but A, because of its fine spot in the imperial citadel, it carries high prestige. But also B, it is still a Chinese-style teapot and thus indicates an association with elite Chinese culture. In all Chinese paintings of social gatherings over food and drink, where the drink is tea, regardless if the participants are the emperor, the political and intellectual elite, or religious leaders, the tea preparation, even if by the kitchen staff, is foregrounded as an important component of the composition. In this Northern Song hanging scroll ascribed to Emperor Huizong, the political and intellectual elites are placed above, the kitchen staff preparing tea are below, but the staff are carefully depicted. And also, they're in the foreground, so foregrounded. Similarly, in this slightly later hand scroll, the Confucian scholar officials look on as a Buddhist abbot writes a sutra or colophon, while on the left, the kitchen staff prepare tea for them. In this hand scroll, high and low social classes are shown equally, with tea preparation in the same compositional level and close by the political and religious elites. In no other Chinese representation of banqueting or beverage consumption is the kitchen staff ever represented so fully. In other words, the preparation of tea was understood to be as important as its service and its consumption. The bottom line is, this teapot cannot indicate lowly status. It was important. The absence of other teapots, though, is curious because of all the collaborative, historical, political, and cultural evidence that I've compiled. All that argues that there must be more. So what is this corroborative evidence that I've been teasing you with? Why is it so reasonable to expect to find these teapots? The reasons are many. Let's start with deep history. Although tea originated in the Himalayan foothills many millennia ago, George Van Dream, I think, says it was like 9 million years ago, most famously in the areas of Sichuan, Hunan, and Yunnan today to the north and east of the Himalayas. It was also indigenous to the west in India, in the area of Assam, and to the south in Southeast Asian areas like Vietnam and Myanmar. Over time, tea plants spread broadly across what I call a tea belt in a region that extends from Northeast India across Southeast Asia and includes Vietnam into southern and coastal China and points further north. Although local Vietnamese groups today have their own distinct tea cultures, some of these also overlap with those of China. And it would have been imperative for them to closely mimic China's tea cultures. Indeed, one indication that China's tea culture spread to Dai Viet is that the Vietnamese share the myth that the first person to discover tea was China's legendary divine farmer Shen Nong. Not only, but also, it is not insignificant that a major tea culture was developing, shall we say brewing, right across Vietnam's border in Yunnan long before the Ming Dynasty. And as noted earlier, from at least the 10th century, Vietnam practiced Chinese-style tea culture with tea bowls, and from at least the 11th century, also tea ewers, as is evident from this and other examples. In texts, the aristocracy referred to China as home of tea. In the 12th through 16th centuries, China traded tea leaf containers to Vietnam. This was a type of container mostly made for shipping tea through the Chinese maritime trade routes to Asia. These kinds of objects, as indicated by the drawings on the screen, have been found in several important archaeological sites in northern Vietnam. Not only was China trading tea and tea containers with Vietnam, but also during the beginning of the Ming and the Hongwu era, the first era, when the teapot was invented, Chinese armies were stationed nearby in Yunnan and brought with them potters from China's most important porcelain capital at Jingdezhen. And there they created blue and white vessels for the army's use. At this time, cobalt was also exported from Yunnan to Vietnam for Vietnam's own blue and white ceramics production. Slightly later in the Yongle period, when the Ming occupied Vietnam, they brought potters with them from Jingdezhen to train the Vietnamese, again, raising local standards. Because the Vietnamese already had high technical ability in ceramics, they were able to quickly improve even further. And even after the Ming were expelled from Dai Viet in 1427, Vietnam continued to produce ceramics in Ming styles, including mainly blue and white ceramics, and at many major sites. When the Ming closed its borders to outside trade, Vietnam was one region that picked up the slack and produced blue and white wares for the world. And I think that when we investigate world collections and really understand what we're looking at, we're going to be able to identify things that are actually from Vietnam and not Jingdezhen. What else? It has become clear that Chinese merchants were continuously active in Vietnam up through at least the 17th century and beyond. This is just one of the Buddhist temples dating to the 15th century, rebuilt on a larger scale in 1897, that helps make the point. When you look closely, well, let me first say, it's located at Dai Viet's major international trading port at the time, a site name of a place called Pho Hien. Those temples that I visited there were sponsored by Fujianese maritime merchants. Inscriptions in their main gates are inlaid with shards of blue and white ceramics, the premier marker of China's international trade. And if you look closely, the words here are infilled with blue and white shards. And there's more. But moreover, throughout the Ming, when steep tea preparations dominated all others, Vietnamese envoys to China strategically displayed their knowledge of Chinese culture to the Chinese imperial court as a diplomatic and state-preserving tactic. In exhibiting their high level of fluency in China's culture, they demonstrated that they did not again need China's help to become civilized. Upon their return, quote, these missions brought back books and other cultural artifacts of interest to Vietnam, unquote. As historian Keith Taylor has argued over time, quote, part of the historic Vietnamese pattern of survival has been to display a sharp knowledge of China, unquote. With tea culture in China taking elite forms, and the most elite being that of steeped tea, the Vietnamese envoy's understanding of Chinese culture must have included a solid grasp of Chinese tea culture in all its current fashions and functions as a social nicety in and prior to any kind of important negotiation. Consequently, they would have had to understand the necessity of a teapot. For that matter, the importance of the Vietnamese market was not lost on China's traders. Back in China, as Ava Schrober has noted, quote, porcelain produced in China's porcelain capital Jingdezhen was often made in shapes and decorated with designs specifically suited to the usage and taste of this Vietnamese market, unquote. Here are some early 18th century teapots made at Jingdezhen that were destined for Vietnam. Mostly white now, they were originally decorated with overglaze enamel colors and probably also underglaze blue painting. Excavated from a 1713 shipwreck, the glaze and decoration have washed off. And by the 17th century, teapots were made for Vietnam at another of China's major teaware producing sites, Yixing, the site where the purple-brown zisha stoneware were produced. In other words, China made Vietnamese-style ceramics for Vietnam and at two of its most important kiln sites for tea ceramics. There was a demand in Vietnam for China's ceramics, and this included teaware. This little pot, made in the 18th or 19th century at Yixing for Vietnamese consumption, is a later example of Vietnamese demand for China's tea culture. It characterizes one aspect of Vietnamese aesthetics distinct from those of China. Unlike Yixing pots made for the Chinese market, the surface of this vessel has been burnished to a high sheen. This appealed to the Vietnamese market of the time. Zisha pots from Yixing for Chinese consumers, as indicated by the example on the right, are rarely shiny. Surely some of these would also date to pre-1700. Where are they? Because China made Vietnamese-style ceramics before 1700, it follows that there may also first be Vietnam-made ceramic models of some sort for them to work from. Historically, China's potters have always required models for their own work, always. And given Vietnam's ceramic traditions and practices and its political situation as a tribute state to China, Vietnam also must have made China-style teapots for its own local consumption and trade. Besides this one, though, where are they? Either way, there must be more than one China-style teapot made in Vietnam during these years, as well as Vietnamese-style vessels developed for use in local tea cultures in this period. Where are they? Not only, but also, and I particularly love this piece of evidence. Back in Vietnam, the best artisans had to work 3 months out of every year at court. There, they would have learned to make the most up-to-date prestige objects, which by this point must have included China-style teapots. And they would have made them for the royal family, aristocrats, and elite others. And then, the way forces of prestige and desire work, once the artisans returned to their hometowns, they would have continued making objects in this mode, spreading imperial culture and China-style tea culture throughout the rest of Dai Viet. For that matter, in the 15th century, when the teapot was invented, the Vietnamese system of rule was China-style. Vietnam had long shared the same plan for cultural policy of disseminating China's culture and learning of China's customs, as indicated by this beautiful site, the Temple of Literature in Hanoi, which was established in 1081. Likewise, its schools emphasized Confucian education, which opened paths to civil service appointments to Vietnamese men. Therefore, it seems this is also the first university in Vietnam. Therefore, it seems reasonable to argue that Vietnam must have developed a China-style tea culture and made its own vessels to suit their needs. All corroborative evidence supports this claim. The question remains, where are the teapots? Material evidence in other ceramic shapes indicates more reasons why we should find China-style teapots in Vietnam. Vietnam's robust ceramics industry adopted many shapes, even prior to the Ming, that were reliant on China's models. As Keith Taylor has explained, quote, the Vietnamese were generally quick to produce their own China-style items, unquote. Some other Chinese shapes that Vietnamese potters copied were wine pouring vessels, mentioned earlier as on the screen, as well as these wine storage pots. The Vietnamese examples are in large scale. Their Chinese prototypes are inset above right in each case. These are but just a few of many, many Vietnamese ceramics based on China's prototypes. Thus, along with this Hanoi teapot, there must have been other pots made before 1700, but they haven't shown up. The closest that I have found, and I just found this in December, which is about the same size as the teapot, same clay, same Hanoi area kiln, same rough date, is this single little pot, or big pot. It's about like this. So, because of its small, close handle, though, as here, it's broken off, but you can see where that handle had been, it can't be a teapot. It must be a type of wine pot. The lack of survival for these Vietnamese teapots may be accidental. Ceramics break. Yet, despite the passage of time and the destruction of warfare, other delicate ceramic objects have survived, and in significant number, as for that matter, have ancient stone buildings and ancient buildings. Why haven't these teapots? If not accidental, might the missing teapots be absent for some cause? Whenever something is absent, significantly absent, it is useful to ask if something else is being legitimized. Could the China-style Vietnamese teapots have been destroyed on purpose? Could the teapots, more than any other ceramic type, have been imbued with too much symbolic cultural capital? Were they perhaps at some point considered too closely aligned with China's power and thus politically too dangerous to own and became taboo and destroyed? Only more research will tell. Thank you so much.
was fabulous. So we have a little bit of time for questions. So if our speakers are game, maybe you could come up here to the podium and we can turn up the lights, I hope. Yes, there we go. And we have... All right. Are there... Everyone's so just like energized by this. Any questions?
Professor Yonan, if there are no immediate questions, we have plenty of questions.
Oh, okay. Well,
but-
we can actually
All right.
start with the dean.
So I'm an earth scientist, and a lot of this talk about teapots and the materials that you use are all geologic materials.
I was hoping you'd go there.
So what role did an understanding of geology play in all of this?
You want to start with, you were talking about minerals.
Sure. So the scientific analysis that I mentioned is only just now being done. And I mean, by just now, I mean in the last 5 years or so. So insofar as what does a geologic understanding entail in the 18th century, that is a little bit more complicated to answer because of the nature of what did they think of that we might class as geology, right? So it's a branch of technical knowledge. What has been, I think, more visible has been the way in which raw materials of geologic origin have shown up in provincial tribute lists. So for example, the lead arsenate that's used for the white enamel, just tracking, first identifying the composition, but then looking back at, where are the sources of this? That's coming in as provincial tribute from Shandong. And those sorts of details definitely reveal a clear awareness on the part of the imperial center as to what raw materials were clustered where and what could be imported from where. Like Zisha clay is particular to the area around Yixing. And so even if there isn't, strictly speaking, a geological awareness, there is unquestionable awareness of certain products come only from certain places, and that makes them rare, important, desirable, and worthy of tribute to the court.
And I guess I would just follow that up with the minerals. They know, for the time, they know what it is. They have a definition, and anything that goes into the mouth is somehow or other a medicine. It's it's either good for you or it's toxic. And so there was certainly an awareness, and I think you're drawing attention to the red pigment would have been related to all sorts of alchemy and alchemical practices. And so I think that there would be tending to bring the minerals and the earth materials into some kind of earth, fire, water, different kinds of feng shui, shall we say, and medicinal kinds of appreciations. I think you should work on teapots. Tamara, did you want to offer?
But actually, the point about geology and where minerals or raw earth materials come from is pertinent also to lacquer.
Yeah.
Particularly, I mean, the coloring agents for colored lacquer. I don't know if you want to talk about that with relationship to your quantities.
I've recently read a study that some Japanese lacquer production uses some lac product from Southeast Asia. And that surprised me because one reason the Europeans couldn't get the raw lacquer is because it congeals and it gets hard. Mm-hmm. So it's like, well, then how is the the Southeast Asian lac going to Japan? But I think maybe they're taking it still in some source material of some kind. Yeah, that's the only way I could think that they could move it, because the Europeans are always bemoaning that they can't really just move the lacquer. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
But before the next question, they're going to close this door structure behind us, and I've been told to warn you that it's loud.
Now we're trapped.
All right. Yeah, I saw Eddie, yeah.
I have a question for you. I was curious if you had encountered in your research catalogs of Japanese or Chinese prints that Europeans could use for their crafting.
Yeah, actually, our colleague at Carleton has been working, Katie Ryer, or Kathleen Ryer, has been working on printed medicinals. And we at Colorado College actually bought one from a dealer that has a French introduction, which I was really like, huh. You know, but then so many Japanese prints went to France that was just another corroboration. So not only did they have courtesan prints and actor prints and all that, they also could get these printed books of Bunshao, like Materia Medica, I think they're sometimes called.
Yeah.
Thanks, three speakers, very much for the intriguing presentations. I'm wondering the change of meanings when wallpaper, lacquer, earthware, teapots cross borders. Can you tell us more about how the users themselves or the buyers themselves, their motives of using it, importing it, relating to their own culture and how they see the Chinese culture at that time? I mean, we have a very popular term, which I'm sure that it doesn't apply at that for that time, cultural appropriation, right?
Yeah.
How do they think about these items cross borders?
Well, one thing I would say about some of the wallpaper rooms is, I didn't know this at first, but they tend to be like the highest status rooms in the house. Like this is for, the ham house screen is in the room that the queen would use when she visited there. So, and a lot of the wallpaper bedrooms are like guest bedrooms for high status visitors. And they are somewhat associated with a little bit of a gender differentiation toward the female side, but not entirely. So I have to like be careful on that because it's not always the case. But I think to me, they create almost like a virtual reality. As you said, they get transformed. So like being in a room with all these trees and flowers and birds, I mean, it's like contemporary art. It's like, wow, now I've walked into a new reality. And not only was it making the room into a different kind of space, but it was also distinct from the rest of the house, you know. So I think there's a lot more to be done in that regard.
Yeah, that's great.
I would say it depends very much on when you're asking about, where you're asking about, and at what social level your question pertains. Because if you asked, what is the French perspective in 1775? What is the English perspective in 1775? And what is the German, German perspective in 1775? I would give you 3 different answers. And I would also give you additionally different answers depending on what material and what context and what the quality was. So yes, there are meanings that change from origin to diaspora, if you will, but then there is no one specific positive, neutral, negative, ambivalent. It fluctuates all over the place. And if you're interested in some of the scholars who have done more of that specific work, let me know, and I can point you towards their scholarship.
Hi, my question is for Professor Burnett. I'm curious about what you'll be looking for as you proceed with your research. It seems like a particularly thorny problem of looking for something that's not there. So,
Right.
yeah.
Well, thank you. Yeah. It's such a, I think I might move on to a different project. This material has been submitted or in practice, partial submission for a book chapter. But I think it's just really a fascinating project to think about. One of the things that I love about research is I like to look at what is culture and what are the forces that shape a culture and transform a culture. And so I may, in this case, have gone about as far as I can find. I mean, I've been looking for almost a decade on this project, and this is as much as I could get. And it's just what remains. Actually, the first time I ever gave beginning of this was for a workshop that Tamara and I organized in 2014, yeah, 10 years ago. Yeah. And I had something and I didn't get much further. And I was like, well, only because I didn't have enough time. Well, I've had more time. So now I think I'm going to start working on some, finish this one and move on to some other also very, very fun projects.
Hi, my question's for Professor Klutgen. Hi, Professor Klutgen. You mentioned during your talk that the enamel using was only found on teaware as opposed to other types. I'm wondering, I guess my question is spurred on in part because yours preceded Professor Burnett's about
Right.
the significance of absence.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, do you have any initial thoughts or guesses as to why it was only found on teaware and the potential significance of that?
Sure. Sunny, is that you? Hi. Sunny did a master's at WashU. I was like, I know that face. Hi. Okay, we'll catch up. Right, easily distracted by former students. Why only on Yixing, you mean, is your question?
Why only on teapots?
Why only on teapots?
Yixing.
Well, I think that has a great deal to do with okay, first let me back up. The only extant painted enamel on Yixing is on teawares. That doesn't mean there wasn't more, but first we're talking about the earliest Chinese enamelwares, full stop. So there isn't a lot, period, from the Kangxi reign, but he gets it started, and it's on that foundation that the painted enamel that goes onto porcelain and copper that really just blows up in the latter 2/3 of the 18th century is built. Kangxi gets all like the dirty stuff out of the way. I have to wonder how many things did not survive. Like what was the experimental failure rate here? Because it had to have been huge. Why do they mostly show up on teawares? I think that is largely because most of the Yixing ware that was produced is more for tea. And the other objects that were made out of Yixing ware, scholars' objects, they're not regular surfaces. So it's a lot easier, especially if you're just getting started with new technology, new pigments, new everything, to take simple forms and do what you can with those. But those are also the same rounded forms that we see on all other substrates, with a few exceptions of metalware. So I think there's a couple of different factors coming into play. It's not like Kangxi was this crazy tea buff, that was his grandson. If you know anything about that. But the painted enamel on Yixing is also unique to Kangxi. There are like 4 black lacquered teapots that are produced. You want to talk about Japan? We'll do that later. That are produced late Yongjang, early Qianlong. There's like 1 Yongjang, there's like 3 or 4 Qianlong, that's it. And that comes out of, I think, a different interest, which is Yongjang, the Yongjang emperor's interest in things Japanese and Japanese lacquer. So they're outliers. It's just like, we got these 20 things that we know about, that's it. And so it's a weird little group, but I also think there's all of these other different factors coming into play. I think a better question is, why Yixing? And that's where the answer is Saxony.
That's what I think too. Yeah. I think you persuaded me.
I think we have time for one more question if anyone would like to ask it. Maybe this person here.
What struck me most about that teapot from Vietnam, the earliest one that you say has ever been found in the 1500s, was that it had an overhead handle.
Yep.
And I wondered, I'm not familiar really a great deal with Chinese teapots, but I don't associate those Chinese teapots with an overhead handle. So did they develop at the same time, or tell me about it?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And the handles are really significant, and I had to cut out something, and that was one of the things that got cut. So significantly, if you're going to have a teapot, usually if it's a pouring vessel, the handle is off the back. Although, and it's a looping, it loops out so you can hold it like this and your fingers aren't against the surface and you're comfortable. The handle above is more of a kettle shape so that you could stand next to a brazier. The fire, say fire comes up and you lift up and you don't burn your fingers from being, if it were a teapot shape, you'd burn your hand, you'd burn your fingers. The thing about the kettle shape with the handle above is that it functions equally for tea service and tea water preparation. So, significantly, there's that one wonderful example that was excavated from an important tomb of a man who died in 1533, and that has the handle above as well. And yet, that same shape shows up as it's like an icon. It shows up again and again in Ming paintings. So, in 16th century paintings. And then, but there is the handle off the side that's a 15th century, the beginning of the 15th century, those teapots. So I think that it's a functional aspect, and that potters using something that's comfortable in the hand and think about their user are making them both ways, and at least from the 1500s on, yeah.
As I said, I'm not familiar with this, but you're referring now to paintings of Chinese teapots contemporary with the Vietnamese one. But are there actual teapots that have been discovered with overhead handles?
Yes. So this one from the tomb of a Ming Dynasty eunuch, this man who died in 1533, that has a teapot about the same size and shape with the overhead handle as the Vietnamese example. And it's not, I don't think it's unique per se in China. I haven't been seeking out overhead handles, but I could. But yeah, I don't think it's unique at all in China.
Would you agree it's unusual? And if so, what conclusions could one draw?
I'm not sure that I would call it unusual. I think first, an issue of extant, how many things are extant. There aren't that many teapots even in China, but there are enough for us to understand what they look like. And then also, they are also recorded on the surfaces in paintings on ink and in ink on paper and silk or on ceramics. So they show up as a motif. So I think it's standard enough that it doesn't beg, it's not so special. It's just sort of amazing period in a different way. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, join me in thanking our speakers, and there's a reception. So thank you guys very much.